The 19th and 20th centuries marked a transformative period in psychology, shaped by pioneering thinkers who laid the foundation for the field. This lecture explores the key figures, their contributions, and how their work influenced modern psychological science. In this lecture, we'll explore the key figures and events that shaped psychology in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Psychology was still emerging as a formal discipline, influenced by philosophy, education reforms, and cultural barriers. We'll begin by examining the zeitgeist of psychology in the 1800s. The ideas and philosophies shaped the field during this time. Then we'll look at the expansion of higher education in the mid-1800s and how new universities influenced psychology's growth. Education was not accessible to everyone. We'll discuss the barriers that minority students faced in pursuing higher education and how systemic limitations influenced opportunities for women and African Americans in psychology. Next, we'll turn to two of the most influential figures of this era: William James, often called the father of American psychology, and G. Stanley Hall, a key figure in developmental psychology and the first president of the American Psychological Association. Beyond James and Hall, we'll explore the contributions of other pioneers in psychology from both the 19th and 20th centuries. These individuals shaped systems such as functionalism, developmental psychology, and the early study of race and gender in psychology. By the end of this lecture, you'll have a deeper understanding of how psychology evolved in America and the people who helped shape it into the scientific discipline it is today. In the 1800s, what was the zeitgeist of USA's psychology? To understand the development of psychology in America, we first need to explore the zeitgeist, or spirit of the times. In the early 1800s, psychology was deeply rooted in philosophy. It was not yet a scientific discipline, and no formal experiments were being conducted. Instead, psychologists relied on observation, reasoning, and introspection to understand the human mind. But change was coming. By the mid-1800s, higher education in the United States expanded, bringing new opportunities for scientific inquiry. As universities grew, so did American psychology, moving away from pure philosophy and closer to empirical study. By the late 1800s, psychology in America began to mirror developments in Europe. It became more scientific than ever, thanks to key figures like Wilhelm Wundt, who established the first psychology laboratory, and Charles Darwin, whose theory of evolution influenced the study of human behavior and mental processes. These changes laid the foundation for psychology as we know it today, shifting from speculation to experimentation and from philosophy to science. Let's begin with the early 1800s, when psychology in the United States was more of a philosophical field than a scientific one. It was deeply influenced by religion, and many professors teaching psychology were also Protestant ministers. At this time, there were only a handful of universities in the country. Institutions like Harvard University, established in 1636, the University of Pennsylvania, established in 1740, and the College of William and Mary, established in 1779, were among the few places where higher education was available. But psychology at this time was not scientific or experimental. There were no research laboratories for professors or students to conduct studies, and no journals existed to publish and share findings. Psychology remained purely theoretical, with little emphasis on empirical investigation. Psychology in the early 1800s was dominated by faculty psychology, a perspective rooted in Scottish realism. Philosophers like Thomas Reid argued that the mind was composed of distinct faculties, each with a specific function, and that these faculties interacted to produce human behavior. Reid divided these faculties into two categories. Intellectual faculties included memory, reasoning, and judgment, while active faculties encompassed free will and emotions. Philosophers of this era believed that any comprehensive theory of the mind should investigate both types of mental operations to fully understand human thought and behavior. If you were a student in 1840 and wanted to take an introductory psychology course, you wouldn't find a class called psychology. Instead, you would enroll in mental philosophy, a course focused on reasoning, morality, and the nature of the soul. And one book in particular shaped the way Americans studied the mind, Elements of Mental Philosophy by Thomas Upham. Published in 1827, Upham's textbook is considered the first American psychology book. Unlike today's psychology textbooks, which emphasize experiments in neuroscience, Upham's work was based on observation and inductive reasoning and reflected the influence of faculty psychology. He divided the mind into three parts: intellect, which included memory and reasoning, sensibilities, which covered emotions, and will, which focused on decision-making and behavior. For decades, Elements of Mental Philosophy was the primary psychology textbook in American colleges. It shaped the education of future psychologists, even as new scientific methods emerged. So next time you read a psychology textbook, remember Thomas Upham, the man who wrote America's first one. Before American psychology developed its own identity, it was shaped by British philosophy. Two major schools of thought, empiricism and associationism, laid the foundation for how early American thinkers understood the mind. Empiricism, championed by philosophers like John Locke, argued that all knowledge comes from experience. The mind, according to Locke, starts as a blank slate and is shaped by sensory input and reflection. Building on this idea, David Hume and James Mill introduced associationism, the theory that mental processes operate by linking ideas together. They believed that simple experiences combine to form complex thoughts through the principles of similarity, contrast, and contiguity. These British ideas strongly influenced early American psychology, even as Scottish realism and faculty psychology dominated university teachings. American psychologists used empiricism and associationism to develop theories about learning, memory, and behavior. By the late 19th century, figures like William James merged these philosophical foundations with scientific methods, marking the shift from speculation to experimentation in American psychology. Understanding the influence of British empiricism and associationism helps us appreciate how American psychology evolved, from philosophical debates to a scientific discipline. In the early 1800s, philosophers sought to understand the mind by observing behavior and identifying the principles behind its faculties. However, psychology was still not an experimental science. Instead of conducting studies, these thinkers speculated about mental processes based on observation. They compared the mind to a muscle, believing that mental health required strengthening the intellectual faculties, such as reasoning and judgment, to overpower the active faculties like emotions and impulses. In other words, rational thinking was seen as a way to control emotions and maintain self-discipline. One example of this idea is emotional intelligence, the ability to regulate emotions in socially acceptable ways. According to this perspective, while it might be appropriate to cry at a funeral, it would not be considered acceptable to cry in a professional setting. Can you think of an example of how you might use your intellectual faculties to overcome your active faculties, as proposed by philosophers in the early 1800s? The field of psychology began to change as higher education underwent a dramatic transformation in the mid-1800s. During this time, waves of immigration brought new ways of thinking and doing. Highly educated individuals, including doctors, teachers, and entrepreneurs, arrived in the United States in large numbers, contributing to the nation's intellectual and professional growth. As the population expanded, so did the demand for education. More people meant more high schools, leading to an increase in college enrollment. With more students attending college, the need for instructors grew, which in turn created a greater demand for graduate education. This shift in higher education played a crucial role in shaping psychology, pushing it toward a more structured and academic discipline, laying the foundation for the field we study today. How did higher education develop in the mid-1800s? To meet the growing demand for higher education, the federal government introduced a new program that would shape the future of American universities. The Morrill Land-Grant Act of 1862 provided every state with 30,000 acres of federal land to establish universities. These institutions focused on agriculture, engineering, and practical education, making higher learning more accessible to a broader population. Between 1776 and 1861, more than 170 colleges were established, and by the late 19th century, research became a core part of university education. At least 41 research labs were operating across universities, fostering scientific inquiry and experimentation. Graduate education also gained momentum. Yale established a graduate program in 1860, followed by Harvard in 1872, laying the foundation for advanced study and professional training in psychology and other disciplines. This map illustrates the impact of the Morrill Land-Grant Act of 1862, a pivotal moment in the expansion of higher education in the United States. Each red dot on the map represents a university that was founded or strengthened as a result of this legislation. Looking across the map, you can see that land-grant institutions exist in every state, from Cornell University in New York to Texas A&M University, Oregon State University, and the University of California system. The Act's reach extended beyond the mainland, establishing institutions in Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and the Pacific Basin. The Morrill Act had a profound impact on American education. By increasing the number of universities, it created a greater demand for professors, research facilities, and graduate education. Today, these land-grant institutions remain leaders in higher education, continuing to drive innovation and public service. Another crucial factor shaped the future of research and innovation: the rise of elite universities modeled after the German system. Johns Hopkins University, founded in 1876, was America's first research university. Unlike traditional colleges focused on classical education, Johns Hopkins emphasized scientific inquiry, experimentation, and graduate education, following the German model pioneered by Wilhelm Wundt and other European scholars. Wealthy benefactors also played a crucial role in shaping higher education. John D. Rockefeller funded the University of Chicago in 1891, aiming to establish a world-class research institution. Similarly, Leland Stanford founded Stanford University in 1891, and the Vanderbilt family supported Vanderbilt University, ensuring long-term investment in education and research. These universities revolutionized American education by shifting the focus from teaching to research, fostering innovation in psychology, medicine, and the sciences. Their impact is still felt today as they continue to lead in global academic research. In the mid to late 1800s, new colleges were established to serve women and African Americans, as many existing universities prohibited them from earning degrees. These institutions provided critical opportunities for higher education to groups that had been historically excluded. By the early 1900s, there were nearly 120 women's colleges across the United States. Institutions such as Vassar College, founded in 1861, and Smith College, established in 1871, paved the way for women's higher education and professional advancement. Similarly, African American colleges expanded rapidly. By the 1940s, nearly 100 historically black colleges and universities, HBCUs, had been established. Among the earliest were Howard University, founded in 1867, and Harris Stowe State University, which opened in 1857 in downtown St. Louis. Clearly, higher education in the United States exploded in the mid-19th century, transforming opportunities for students from diverse backgrounds and laying the groundwork for a more inclusive academic landscape. In the late 19th century, universities underwent a major transformation, shifting their focus toward the scientific method and the creation of new knowledge. Rather than simply teaching established ideas, institutions began prioritizing research, experimentation, and discovery. One of the most significant changes during this time was the growing separation between religion and science. For centuries, higher education had been closely tied to religious instruction, with many professors also serving as priests or theologians. However, as science advanced, universities began treating religion and science as distinct fields of study. This shift had a profound impact on how subjects like biology and psychology were taught. Professors were no longer expected to uphold religious doctrine, and many openly supported evolution rather than creationism. As a result, universities became centers of scientific progress, fostering new ways of thinking that would shape the future of psychology and other disciplines. In the final 2 decades of the 1800s, American psychology embraced what became known as the New Psychology. This shift made psychology more scientific, aligning with Wilhelm Wundt's German experimental methods while also incorporating elements of Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. However, this evolutionary influence would not last. Following World War I, psychology took a new direction, with behaviorism replacing evolutionary theory as the dominant approach. Universities also began redefining their role. Instead of relying on traditional philosophical methods or repackaging old ideas, they focused on research and the creation of new knowledge. To achieve this, they actively recruited the brightest students from around the world, offering fellowship packages that included tuition and stipends. This shift ensured that American psychology continued to grow as a rigorous, evidence-based scientific discipline. What barriers did minority students face in the 1800s? In the mid-1800s, African Americans and women began to access higher education, but major obstacles persisted throughout the 19th century. Earning a college degree remained a challenge due to systemic exclusion, discrimination, and limited opportunities for marginalized groups. Most universities catered exclusively to middle and upper-class European American males, while individuals from diverse racial, ethnic, gender, religious, and socioeconomic backgrounds were actively discouraged from enrolling. Even when opportunities arose, minority students faced segregation, prejudice, and inadequate resources, making academic success an uphill battle. One of the greatest barriers was the outright exclusion of minority students from undergraduate and graduate programs. Many institutions simply did not accept African Americans, women, and other marginalized groups, making it nearly impossible for them to earn degrees. For women, some institutions allowed them to complete coursework but refused to grant diplomas. A well-known example is Mary Whiton Calkins, who completed all the requirements for a PhD at Harvard University, but was denied the degree because she was a woman. For African Americans, the restrictions were even more severe. Before the Civil War, black codes, laws enacted in southern states, explicitly made it illegal for African Americans to receive an education. These laws ensured that enslaved and free black individuals remained socially and economically powerless by preventing them from acquiring knowledge that could lead to social mobility and political activism. Even in states where education was technically legal for African Americans, systemic barriers remained. Many schools refused to admit black students, arguing that higher education should remain exclusively for white men. When black students were accepted, they often attended underfunded schools with inadequate resources, unqualified teachers, and poor facilities compared to white institutions. After the Civil War, Jim Crow laws reinforced segregation in public institutions, including universities. These laws ensured that black students had fewer opportunities than their white peers, perpetuating racial inequality for generations. At the same time, racist beliefs about intelligence were used to justify exclusion from higher education. Many Americans falsely believed that African Americans and women were intellectually inferior and unsuited for rigorous academic study. These harmful stereotypes discouraged many from even attempting to pursue higher education. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, pseudoscientific theories were widely used to limit women's access to higher education and professional fields. Women were expected to fulfill traditional roles as wives, mothers, and caregivers rather than pursuing careers. Even those who remained unmarried were expected to take care of aging parents, a responsibility rarely placed on their brothers. At the same time, false scientific claims reinforced gender-based discrimination. The variability hypothesis suggested that men exhibited a wider range of intelligence, including more geniuses, while women's intelligence remained closer to the average, a theory used to justify excluding women from higher education. The women's sphere theory claimed that menstruation made women emotionally unstable and intellectually impaired, reinforcing the stereotype that they were too fragile for academia. Modern research has completely debunked these ideas, proving that men and women have equal cognitive abilities, and that menstrual cycles do not affect intelligence or decision-making. However, these false claims delayed gender equality in education for decades. In the late 19th century, many educators and scientists assumed that black children were inherently less intelligent than white children, despite having no scientific evidence to support this claim. In 1897, psychologist G.R. Stetson conducted a study comparing memory abilities in 1,000 black and white children in Washington, D.C. He found no difference in their ability to memorize poems, contradicting the racist assumptions of the time. However, rather than challenging racial bias, Stetson reinterpreted his findings. Instead of concluding that intelligence was not racially determined, he dismissed memorization as a poor measure of intelligence. This demonstrates how scientific bias reinforced existing prejudices rather than correcting them. In the 1800s and early 1900s, one of the biggest obstacles for African Americans pursuing psychology was the lack of research opportunities. Minority-serving colleges offered psychology courses but lacked resources, faculty, and laboratory facilities needed to prepare students for graduate programs. Segregation in Southern universities meant that African Americans were systematically excluded from most graduate schools. While some Northern universities accepted black students, very few were admitted, making access to advanced education nearly impossible. For those of you considering graduate school today, you know that research experience is essential for admission into competitive programs. The same was true in the 1800s. Without proper training, African American students were often denied entry into higher education, significantly limiting their opportunities in the field of psychology. Even for minority students who managed to earn a degree, the challenges did not end at graduation. African American and female graduates were excluded from faculty positions at prestigious universities. Many were forced to teach at minority-serving colleges, which had lower salaries, fewer resources, and limited research funding. With fewer graduate students to mentor and fewer opportunities for professional advancement, minority scholars faced significant disadvantages compared to their white male counterparts. This lack of institutional support made it difficult for minority psychologists to establish long-term academic careers, further reinforcing racial and gender inequality in the field. Who was William James? How did he contribute to psychology? William James is one of the most important figures in the history of psychology. He is often referred to as the first American psychologist and the father of American psychology, shaping the field with his groundbreaking ideas. He also wrote about many other topics, including epistemology, education, metaphysics, religion, and mysticism. To understand his place in psychology, it's important to compare him to Wilhelm Wundt, the founder of experimental psychology. While they were active during the same time period, their methods and philosophies set them apart. Wundt emphasized controlled experiments and precise measurements, but James believed psychology should focus on the function of mental processes and their role in adaptation. This difference would later influence the division between structuralism and functionalism in American psychology. James was born in New York City to a wealthy family who valued education. His grandfather was one of the wealthiest men in the USA, earning his money as a businessman. His family was full of brilliant and motivated individuals. Throughout his life, he would make 16 trips to Europe. Thus, he valued education and would go on to study and work at one of the most prestigious universities in the country. In 1865, William James embarked on a transformative journey to the Amazon with his biology professor, Louis Agassiz. While Agassiz was a strong opponent of Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, James found his own evidence supporting Darwin's ideas. This experience shaped his scientific thinking and encouraged him to question traditional beliefs. By the time he completed medical school in 1869, James had already become a well-traveled scholar who spoke several languages. However, despite his medical training, he never practiced medicine. Instead, he followed his passion for psychology and philosophy, fields that would define his legacy. In the 1870s, he traveled to Germany, where he studied experimental physiology with some of the leading scientists of the time, including Hermann von Helmholtz. This exposure to German experimental methods would later influence his approach to psychology, helping him bridge the gap between philosophy and science. James's influence shaped the way psychology developed in the United States, and his ideas are still relevant today. Of course, James made many contributions to psychology, but let's focus on just a few. First, when he returned from Germany, he began teaching physiology and psychology at Harvard University. Starting in 1875, he offered the first psychology course in the United States. At the time, psychology was still emerging as a distinct discipline, and James was instrumental in bringing German physiological psychology to American students. In fact, Stanley Hall later wrote that James's courses were the only ones in the U.S. that truly incorporated German experimental methods. James continued to teach at Harvard for over 30 years, shaping the minds of future psychologists. Second, in 1875, James created an experimental psychology lab at Harvard, not as a research facility, but as a way to demonstrate psychological concepts during lectures. This was similar to Wilhelm Wundt's approach, though James was never as committed to laboratory-based methods as Wundt was. Third, he was highly critical of brass instrument psychology, the dominant laboratory-based approach that measured reaction times, sensory perceptions, and physiological responses. He argued that these mechanical measurements were too narrow and reductionist, failing to capture the complexity of human thought, emotions, and consciousness. James also played a crucial role in shaping the next generation of psychologists and leaders. At Harvard University, James oversaw the first ever doctorate in psychology, which was earned by Stanley Hall in 1878. Hall would go on to become a pioneer in developmental psychology and a major figure in establishing psychology as a formal discipline in the U.S. James also mentored Mary Whiton Calkins, who became the first female president of the American Psychological Association. Despite completing the requirements for a doctorate at Harvard, she was denied the degree because she was a woman. Nonetheless, she made significant contributions to psychology, particularly in the areas of self-psychology and memory research. His influence extended beyond psychology. James taught E.L. Thorndike, who later became a key figure in educational psychology and behaviorism, as well as Theodore Roosevelt, who went on to become the 26th President of the United States. James's mentorship demonstrates not only his intellectual contributions, but also his lasting impact on students, many of whom went on to shape psychology, education, and even national politics. One of James's most significant contributions to psychology was his groundbreaking textbook, The Principles of Psychology, published in 1890. This 2-volume work provided a comprehensive exploration of psychology as a discipline, covering topics such as habits, consciousness, emotion, and perception. Recognizing the need for a shorter, more accessible version, he published Psychology, the briefer course, in 1892. This condensed edition became widely used in classrooms. James outlined a variety of psychological methods, including introspection, experiments, and questionnaires. However, he strongly favored introspection, believing that self-observation provided the best insights into consciousness. Despite his preference, introspection as a method would eventually decline, replaced by experimental approaches. Unlike early psychologists who sought to break consciousness down into basic elements, James argued that consciousness is a continuous and adaptive process. He viewed it as a tool that helps humans quickly solve problems and adjust to their environment. One of his key ideas was the role of habits in human behavior. He believed that habits free up mental energy, allowing us to focus on critical survival tasks, rather than consciously analyzing everything we see, hear, or do. James argued that the rational mind can never fully believe that life has inherent meaning. He recognized that from a purely logical perspective, the universe appears indifferent, and any search for objective meaning seems futile. However, instead of falling into despair, James encouraged us to think and act as if life has meaning. He believed that we create our own sense of purpose through imagination and action. By fantasizing about the future, we give ourselves goals to strive for, which in turn creates a sense of direction and motivation. This act of envisioning possibilities gives our lives structure and significance. But it doesn't stop at imagination. James emphasized the importance of taking action. By actively working toward our goals, we cultivate fulfillment and happiness. In other words, happiness is not something we find, it's something we create through purposeful engagement with life. James believed our thoughts, shape our reality. Note this quote, "Believe that life is worth living and your belief will help create the fact." He argued that our mindset influences our experiences. When we choose to believe that life is meaningful and worth living, our actions begin to reflect that belief. We engage more with the world, seek out opportunities, and persevere through challenges. Over time, this belief becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Our lives gain purpose simply because we acted as if they already had it. James didn't mean that belief alone is enough. He emphasized that belief leads to action, and action creates reality. When we adopt a hopeful mindset and put in the effort to build a fulfilling life, we turn that belief into fact. This idea aligns with modern psychology, showing that optimism, resilience, and a sense of purpose contribute to well-being and success. In other words, by choosing to believe in a meaningful life, we create one. James served as the third president of the American Psychological Association, APA, in 1894. His contributions to the field went far beyond leadership. He helped establish functionalism, a major school of thought in psychology. Although James did not personally identify as a functionalist, he is widely considered its founder. His perspective differed from the structuralist approach, which focused on analyzing the individual components of consciousness. Instead, James argued that psychology should study the function of mental processes and behavior, how they operate in real life, and help individuals adapt to their environment. Functionalism emphasized the purpose of thoughts and behaviors, rather than breaking them down into isolated elements. This approach laid the foundation for applied psychology and influenced later psychological movements, including behaviorism and cognitive psychology. James' ideas helped shift psychology toward a more dynamic and practical science, one that examines how human thought and behavior contribute to survival and success in the real world. James had a revolutionary perspective on consciousness. He described it as personal, selective, and ever-changing. Rather than seeing consciousness as a static collection of thoughts, he viewed it as a continuous stream, constantly shifting and adapting to new experiences. James also believed in the existence of a subconscious, a part of the mind that processes information outside of our immediate awareness. He pointed to everyday experiences as evidence, such as the tip of the tongue phenomenon, where we know we have information stored in our minds but struggle to recall it. He also emphasized the role of habits. According to James, habits free up mental energy, allowing consciousness to focus on adaptation and problem-solving rather than routine tasks. For example, once we learn to walk, drive, or even play an instrument, these actions become automatic, so our conscious mind can focus on more complex decisions. By understanding both consciousness and subconscious processes, James helped lay the groundwork for modern cognitive and behavioral psychology. Who was G. Stanley Hall? How did he contribute to psychology? If William James is known as the father of American psychology, G. Stanley Hall is considered the son of American psychology. Hall was one of the most influential figures in early American psychology, playing a crucial role in promoting and expanding the field during the late 1800s and early 1900s. Born in Massachusetts, Hall was raised by loving and supportive parents. They nurtured his passion for learning and encouraged his intellectual curiosity. This foundation would set him on a path to become a pioneering force in psychology, shaping the discipline through both his research and institutional leadership. In 1878, he made history by earning America's first PhD in psychology from Harvard University. His dissertation was supervised by none other than William James, one of the most influential figures in early American psychology. Under James' mentorship, Hall's work set the stage for psychology as an independent field of study in the United States. This milestone was a turning point for psychology in higher education, paving the way for future graduate programs and research in psychological science. Hall's journey into psychology began when he read Wilhelm Wundt's Principles of Psychology. Inspired by this work, he traveled to Germany in 1879 to further explore physiological psychology under Wundt himself. However, Hall was not impressed. He found Wundt's experimental methods and laboratory work unconvincing. Instead of focusing on reaction times and perception, Hall became fascinated with human development and evolutionary psychology. It's clear that Charles Darwin had a profound influence on Hall's thinking. He was particularly interested in how evolutionary theory could be applied to psychology. Upon returning to the U.S., Hall went on to teach at Johns Hopkins University and later became the first president of Clark University. Both universities were major centers for psychological research in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and they remain important institutions for psychology today. G. Stanley Hall was a pioneer in American psychology, making several groundbreaking contributions that shaped the field. One of his most significant achievements was establishing the first experimental psychology laboratory in the United States. By this time, Wilhelm Wundt had already set up his lab in Germany, and William James had created a lab at Harvard. But there was a key difference. Unlike James, Hall actively conducted experiments. His research covered a wide range of topics, many of which fell under the umbrella of genetic psychology. This field focuses on the origins and development of consciousness and behavior, reflecting the strong influence of Darwin's work on Hall's ideas. His studies examined how psychological traits develop over time and how evolution shapes human behavior. Hall's second major contribution came in 1887 when he founded the American Journal of Psychology, the first academic psychology journal in the United States. Why was this so important? Before journals like this, psychological research had little formal organization, and findings were not widely shared. Academic journals provided a structured way for researchers to publish their studies, exchange ideas, and build on each other's work. The establishment of such journals was a crucial step in advancing psychology as a scientific discipline. This is a historical photograph of Hall's laboratory at Johns Hopkins University. The image showcases an early psychological research environment, complete with various scientific instruments, microscopes, and testing equipment used for physiological and psychological studies. The room is filled with wooden cabinets storing chemical bottles, research materials, and brass instruments for experimental psychology. Several laboratory tables are arranged with equipment, reflecting Hall's commitment to empirical research. This space likely facilitated studies on child development, education, and adolescence, topics that Hall heavily influenced. It was in laboratories like this that psychology transitioned from a philosophical discipline to an empirical science in the United States. After making major contributions to psychology, G. Stanley Hall continued his work at Clark University, where he became its first president in 1889. His leadership helped shape the institution into a hub for psychological research and scientific inquiry. At Clark, Hall emphasized the use of science and evidence-based approaches across all academic disciplines, aligning with the broader movement in universities toward empirical research and experimentation. One of Hall's key initiatives at Clark was the establishment of another experimental psychology laboratory, this time with superior equipment and financial resources. This lab became one of the best equipped in the country and provided new opportunities for groundbreaking research. The studies conducted at Clark covered a wide range of topics, focusing on developmental psychology, studying how children and adolescents grow and learn, abnormal psychology, investigating psychological disorders and atypical behaviors, and comparative psychology, comparing behaviors across different species. Under the leadership of Edmund Sanford, the lab at Clark produced significant research in the 1890s, including the first maze learning studies, which became foundational in behavioral psychology. By the early 20th century, Clark University's graduate school had become one of the most popular and influential psychology programs in the world. It attracted students from diverse backgrounds and different countries, cementing its reputation as a leading center for psychological research and education. Now let's talk about a major milestone in psychology, one that should sound familiar. In 1892, G. Stanley Hall founded the first professional organization for psychology in the United States, the American Psychological Association, the APA. Not only did he establish the APA, but he also served as its first president. His leadership shaped the organization's goals and direction for decades to come. Hall's work in establishing the APA was crucial in uniting psychologists under a professional network, encouraging collaboration and helping psychology gain credibility as a scientific discipline. One of Hall's most significant contributions was in the field of developmental psychology. During the late 1800s and early 1900s, Hall was a pioneer in studying human development across the lifespan. For example, he was the first psychologist to identify adolescence as a distinct stage of development, what he famously described as a time of storm and stress. This idea shaped modern developmental psychology and influenced how we understand teenage behavior today. He detailed these findings in his book, Adolescence, Its Psychology and Its Relations to Physiology, Anthropology, Sociology, Sex, Crime, and Religion, which was published in 1931. Hall didn't just focus on youth, he also explored the psychological changes associated with adulthood and aging. As he personally experienced these stages, he documented his observations and expanded the study of human development beyond adolescence. Through his work, Hall helped establish the foundation of developmental psychology, shaping how we view the psychological growth of individuals across their entire lives. One of Hall's most well-known and controversial ideas was his application of recapitulation theory to human development. Recapitulation theory is the idea that the development of an individual mirrors the evolutionary history of the species. In other words, Hall believed that as a child grows, they pass through stages that resemble the evolutionary past of humans. Hall argued that infants, children, and adolescents go through psychological and behavioral phases that reflect the stages of human evolution. Infancy is similar to early primitive humans. Babies are impulsive and instinct-driven. Childhood resembles early human societies. Toddlers are playful, curious, and exploratory. Adolescence is a critical period of transformation, mirroring the transition from primitive societies to modern civilization. Hall was deeply influenced by Charles Darwin and Herbert Spencer. He saw human development as an extension of evolutionary progress, with each stage contributing to a more refined, intelligent, and socially advanced adult. He argued that adolescence was a crucial stage where individuals transitioned from savage, animalistic tendencies to rational, civilized thought. While Hall's theory was influential in early developmental psychology, it has since been debunked. Modern research shows that child development is shaped by a mix of genetic, environmental, and social influences, rather than simply replaying human evolution. Hall's legacy is also marked by controversial views on eugenics, a movement that sought to control human reproduction to promote what were seen as desirable traits while discouraging or preventing the reproduction of those deemed unfit. He was heavily influenced by Darwin's theory of evolution and Herbert Spencer's social Darwinism, the idea that human societies, like biological organisms, evolved over time, with the fittest individuals rising to the top. He saw human development as a reflection of evolutionary progress, and this extended to his belief that certain populations were biologically superior. He advocated for policies that promoted the reproduction of individuals he considered more intellectually and morally fit, while discouraging reproduction among those he deemed less fit. Hall also expressed views on racial hierarchies, arguing that different ethnic groups were at different stages of evolutionary development, a perspective that was used to justify discrimination. He believed education should be designed to nurture those with superior traits while limiting opportunities for those considered inferior. His views were particularly concerning regarding immigration, race, and intelligence, aligning with the broader eugenics movement that sought to restrict access to education and employment for marginalized groups. The eugenics movement was later used to justify forced sterilization laws in the U.S. and influenced Nazi ideology in Germany. Today, psychology rejects eugenics-based theories, recognizing that intelligence, behavior, and ability are shaped by a complex mix of genetic, environmental, and social factors, not racial or biological determinism. Hall was undeniably a key figure in American psychology, but his endorsement of eugenics serves as a reminder of the dangers of misapplying scientific theories to justify inequality. His contributions to developmental psychology remain influential, but his advocacy for social policies based on flawed science is now widely condemned. In 1909, Hall organized a groundbreaking conference at Clark University, where he extended an invitation to none other than Sigmund Freud to lecture about his work. Hall's decision to invite Freud was no coincidence. The two shared overlapping interests: human development, sexuality, and abnormal psychology, which made Hall an ideal supporter of Freud's emerging field of psychoanalysis. This event marked Freud's first and only trip to the United States. At the time, Freud's ideas were still gaining traction, and he saw this invitation as a pivotal moment, a sign that his theories were beginning to receive international recognition. Hall's invitation played a crucial role in introducing Freud's work to American psychologists, setting the stage for the growing influence of psychoanalytic thought in the 20th century. This now iconic photograph captures a historic moment at the conference at Clark University. At the center of the image stands Hall himself, a pioneering figure in American psychology. To his right, we see Sigmund Freud, who traveled from Austria for what would be his first and only trip to the United States. Freud saw this invitation as a major milestone, signaling that his work was gaining international recognition. To the left, holding a hat, is William James, often referred to as the father of American psychology. Surrounding them are other notable figures, including James Cattell, Edward Titchener, Carl Jung, and Henry Goddard, all of whom made significant contributions to the field. What can this photo tell us about the development of psychology? This image is more than just a gathering of great minds. It offers insight into the growth and structure of psychology at the time. The presence of Freud, Jung, and other European psychologists shows how psychological ideas traveled across continents. It highlights the exchange of theories and methods that shaped modern psychology. Notice anything missing in this photo? There are no women. Many of these men were part of a group called the Experimentalists, founded by Edward Titchener. This group explicitly excluded women from their meetings. However, to his credit, Titchener did mentor and support several women in psychology, but only outside of these gatherings. This conference was a landmark event in psychology, demonstrating both its rapid development and its early limitations. The discussions that took place here shaped the trajectory of psychological research for decades to come. In 19th century USA, who was influential in psychology? How did Calkins and Lad Franklin contribute to psychology? The 19th century was a period of extreme inequality in higher education, with explicit exclusion, racial stereotypes, and systemic barriers preventing African Americans and women from accessing psychology and other academic fields. However, early pioneers persisted. Figures like Mary Whiton Calkins, Christine Ladd Franklin, and Frances Sumner fought for their place in academia, paving the way for future generations of psychologists. Their struggles highlight the importance of inclusion in education and remind us of the ongoing work needed to ensure equal access to learning and professional opportunities for all. When discussing influential figures in early American psychology, one name that cannot be overlooked is Mary Whiton Calkins. Despite her groundbreaking work and intellectual accomplishments, she faced significant barriers simply because she was a woman. Calkins studied under some of the greatest minds in psychology, including William James and Hugo Münsterberg, yet she was never awarded a doctorate, despite completing all the necessary requirements at Harvard. At the time, Harvard refused to grant doctoral degrees to women, a policy that reflected the systemic exclusion of women from higher education and professional recognition. However, that did not stop her from making history. In 1905, she became the first woman elected president of the American Psychological Association, marking a milestone for women in psychology. As her academic interests shifted toward philosophy, she continued to break barriers. In 1918, she became the first woman elected president of the American Philosophical Association, an equally prestigious achievement. Calkins was a trailblazer in psychology, but her path was far from easy. Her story highlights both the barriers women faced in higher education and the persistence needed to overcome them. Calkins began her undergraduate studies at Smith College, a women's college, where she excelled academically. But her true passion for psychology developed when she attended classes with William James at Harvard. Around the same time he published his famous textbook, The Principles of Psychology, in 1890. James had a profound influence on her, but he was not an experimentalist. Calkins wanted hands-on research experience. Despite being barred from official student status at Harvard due to her gender, she pursued her education with determination. She completed an important dissertation on association, a critical area of psychological research. Seeking more experimental training, Calkins turned to Clark University, where she worked under Edmund Sanford in the laboratory that Stanley Hall had established. This experience gave her exposure to cutting-edge psychological experiments. Later, she returned to Harvard to study with Hugo Munsterberg, further deepening her expertise in experimental psychology. Although she was denied a Harvard PhD, Calkins made significant contributions to psychology and philosophy, proving that determination and intellect could break barriers, even when institutions refused to recognize them. One of her most famous achievements was her invention of paired associate learning, a memory technique that remains relevant today. This is a method designed to strengthen memory associations. Calkins investigated various factors that influence memory, such as frequency, how often something is repeated; recency, how recently information was learned; vividness, how striking or distinct information is; and primacy, how well we remember the first items in a sequence. Her research revealed that frequency was the most important factor in developing associative strength. Imagine you're learning word pairs, like snow and alligator. First, you are shown all the word pairs. Then you are shown one of the words in a pair and asked to recall the other word. You receive feedback, and correct answers are reinforced. Over multiple trials, you strengthen the connection between the pairs of words. Eventually, you would memorize and recall them instantly. This technique is still used today in education, language learning, and even cognitive therapy. Calkins's research not only expanded our understanding of memory and learning, but also paved the way for future studies in cognitive psychology. Her work proves that great minds can leave a lasting impact, even when institutions refuse to recognize them. Christine Ladd Franklin was a remarkable woman who made significant strides in both psychology and mathematics, all while challenging the deeply entrenched gender barriers of her time. She was an American psychologist and mathematician who fought tirelessly for gender equality in academia. At a time when higher education was largely inaccessible to women, she refused to accept the status quo. Ladd Franklin was known for her social activism, passionately advocating for increased opportunities for women in undergraduate, graduate, and postgraduate education. She faced countless obstacles in her career. Despite her qualifications, she was repeatedly denied teaching positions at universities simply because she was a woman. But she didn't stay silent. She directly confronted the systemic discrimination she faced. One of the most notable examples was her protest against Edward Titchener's exclusion of women from his exclusive group of experimentalists. Titchener, a leader in experimental psychology, refused to admit women to his professional meetings, barring them from important discussions and networking opportunities. Ladd Franklin wrote to him in protest, challenging his stance and advocating for the inclusion of women in scientific discourse. Her determination helped pave the way for future generations of women in psychology. Though she faced rejection time and time again, her advocacy contributed to the slow but steady progress toward gender equity in the field. Ladd Franklin's legacy is not just in her contributions to psychology, but also in her relentless fight for equal opportunities in academia. She serves as a powerful reminder that progress is often made by those who refuse to accept injustice. How do you think Christine Ladd Franklin's activism influenced the role of women in psychology today? What barriers still exist for women in STEM fields? Ladd Franklin's journey through academia was filled with challenges, yet she persisted, leaving a lasting impact on psychology and mathematics. Like Mary Whiton Calkins, she began her education at a women's college, Vassar, where she graduated in 1866. Determined to continue her studies, she attended Johns Hopkins University in the 1870s, where she worked toward a doctorate in mathematics. In 1882, she completed all the requirements for her PhD, but there was one problem. Johns Hopkins refused to award her the degree. Why? Because she was a woman. It wasn't until 1926, over 4 decades later, that the university finally granted her the doctorate she had rightfully earned. Despite these barriers, Lad Franklin made significant contributions to the field of psychology, particularly in visual perception. Without access to a lab, another consequence of institutional sexism, her work was mostly theoretical. She studied with some of the leading figures in vision science, including Johannes Müller and Hermann von Helmholtz, and developed important theories on color vision. Her perseverance in the face of exclusion is a testament to her brilliance and determination. Even when institutions denied her opportunities, she found ways to contribute to scientific knowledge. Christine Ladd Franklin made significant contributions to the study of vision, particularly in the development of her evolutionary theory of color vision, which she published in 1929 in her book, Color and Color Theories. Unlike previous theories, Ladd Franklin's model proposed that color vision developed gradually over time, evolving in distinct stages. Her theory was based on both evolutionary biology and experimental psychology, suggesting that human color perception evolved in a specific order. Achromatic vision, black and white, appeared first. In early evolution, organisms needed to detect light and dark contrasts for survival. This was essential for navigating the environment, detecting movement, and distinguishing between safe and dangerous surroundings. This explains why even in low light conditions, humans can still see shapes and outlines in grayscale. Blue-yellow sensitivity appeared second. As species evolved, they developed the ability to detect colors, beginning with blue and yellow. This intermediate stage allowed organisms to differentiate objects beyond just black and white, which would have been advantageous for distinguishing between sky and ground, day and night, or edible and toxic substances. Red-green sensitivity developed last. The final evolutionary stage involved the perception of red and green, which Ladd Franklin believed was the most fragile and most likely to be lost due to color blindness. This part of the spectrum is the most complex in human vision, requiring more advanced neural processing. She argued that this is why red-green color blindness is more common than other types of color deficiencies. This theory is important because she challenged dominant theories at the time, particularly the young Helmholtz trichromatic theory and the Herring opponent process theory, by introducing an evolutionary perspective. Her theory suggested that color vision was not static but developed over time, providing a more dynamic and biologically rooted explanation. It also explained why some types of color blindness are more common than others, based on how color perception evolved. Despite being overlooked in her time due to gender discrimination, Ladd Franklin's work remains influential in discussions of vision science and evolutionary psychology. In 20th century USA, who was influential in psychology? How did Washburn, Sumner, and the Clarks contribute to psychology? Now we're going to talk about Margaret Floy Washburn. She is best known as the first woman to earn a PhD in psychology, a groundbreaking achievement at a time when women faced significant barriers in higher education. In 1894, Washburn earned her doctorate from Cornell University, where she studied under Edward Titchener. In fact, she was his very first PhD student. Before that, like Calkins and Ladd Franklin, Washburn earned her undergraduate degree from a women's college, Vassar. This is an important reminder of how minority-serving institutions played a crucial role in making higher education more accessible to those excluded from mainstream universities. Washburn's impact on psychology extended far beyond her research. She was elected president of the American Psychological Association in 1921, making her one of the first women to lead the organization. She also co-edited the American Journal of Psychology for over a decade, ensuring that emerging research continued to shape the field. Her contributions were so significant that she was inducted into the National Academy of Sciences in 1931, a rare honor for a woman at the time. Washburn's research was diverse, spanning perception, visual imagery, empathy, helping behavior, and consciousness, not just in humans, but also in animals. She became one of the leading voices in comparative psychology, a field that explores the similarities and differences between human and animal cognition. In 1908, she compiled and analyzed experimental research in comparative psychology and published The Animal Mind, a widely used text that examined the sensory and mental capacities of animals. This book was one of the first major works in the field and helped establish animal psychology as a legitimate area of study. Washburn's work helped legitimize comparative psychology, broaden our understanding of animal cognition, and pave the way for future generations of women in psychology. Let's fast forward to the 1920s, a time of significant social and academic change. It was during this period that Francis Sumner made history as the first African American to earn a Ph.D. in psychology in 1920. His journey was far from easy. Despite facing racial barriers in higher education, Sumner persevered and carved out a legacy that would pave the way for future Black psychologists. He began his graduate studies at Clark University in 1917, working under Stanley Hall, one of the most influential figures in American psychology. However, in 1918, his studies were interrupted when he was drafted into World War I. While serving in Germany, he took the opportunity to learn German, a skill that would later prove valuable in his academic career. After being discharged in 1919, he returned to Clark University and completed his doctorate just 1 year later, officially earning his Ph.D. in 1920. From 1928 to 1954, Sumner chaired the psychology department at Howard University, one of the leading historically Black universities in the country. He established influential bachelor's and master's degree programs to expand psychology education. His research addressed critical social issues, including racial bias, religion, and justice. He mentored and inspired the next generation of Black psychologists, including two figures who would play a pivotal role in the civil rights movement, Kenneth B. Clark and Mamie Phipps Clark. Sumner's impact stretched beyond his lifetime. By building a strong academic foundation at Howard University, he helped break racial barriers in psychology and inspired research that challenged racial segregation in education. Throughout his career, Sumner wrote over 2,000 abstracts for respected journals, including the Journal of Social Psychology and Psychology Bulletin. His scholarly work helped make psychological research more accessible and widely recognized. Sumner critically analyzed the theories of both Freud and Adler, exploring their differing views on personality and human behavior. Here is an excerpt from one of his articles where he describes the famous feud between Freud and Adler. Kenneth B. Clark and Mamie Phipps Clark were trailblazing American psychologists whose work left a lasting impact on both psychology and civil rights. The two met at Howard University in the 1930s, where they studied under Francis Sumner, the first African American to earn a Ph.D. in psychology. Under his mentorship, they earned their bachelor's and master's degrees, developing a passion for applying psychology to real-world issues. In 1937, they married, becoming not only life partners but also research collaborators dedicated to using psychology as a tool for social change. Their journey was just beginning, and their contributions would soon help reshape American history. Kenneth B. Clark was a pioneer in the field, breaking racial barriers at some of the most prestigious institutions in the United States. In 1940, Clark became the first African American to earn a Ph.D. in psychology at Columbia University, a significant achievement in a time of widespread racial discrimination in higher education. Just 2 years later, he made history again, becoming the first African American to receive tenure as a psychology professor at City College of New York. He would dedicate over 3 decades to teaching, mentoring, and advancing the field of psychology there. And in 1971, his impact reached even further. Clark became the first African American president of the American Psychological Association. His leadership symbolized a new era of inclusion and recognition for Black psychologists. Through persistence and dedication, Kenneth B. Clark reshaped the landscape of psychology, paving the way for future generations of scholars and activists. In 1943, Mamie Phipps Clark became the second African American to earn a PhD in psychology at Columbia University, following in the groundbreaking footsteps of her husband, Kenneth B. Clark. But their work extended far beyond academia. Together, they used psychology to make a real difference in their community. In the 1940s, the Clarks founded the Northside Center for Child Development, a community center in New York dedicated to improving the quality of life for young African American children. Their mission was clear: to provide mental health services, educational support, and social programs to address the unique challenges faced by minority children. As psychologists, the Clarks also conducted research on racial bias in education and child development. They found that the struggles minority children faced weren't just individual problems. They were shaped by social, economic, and institutional forces. Their work emphasized that solutions needed to happen on multiple levels, both individual and societal. Addressing racial disparities in education required systemic change. Decades later, their vision continues. The Northside Center remains a vital resource for children and families in New York City, proving that the Clarks' legacy lives on, not just in textbooks, but in real-world impact. In the early 20th century, schools in the United States were heavily segregated. Black and white children attended separate schools that were supposed to be equal, but were anything but. Black schools often lacked resources, had outdated materials, and were in poor condition compared to white schools. But the effects of segregation ran even deeper than just school conditions. It affected children's self-perception and identity. This was the social backdrop for one of the most influential psychological studies in American history, the Clark doll studies. In the 1930s, the Clarks set out to explore a critical question: how did racial segregation impact the self-perception of children? Their research would later play a major role in shaping the civil rights movement and transforming American education. They designed a series of experiments and compared the self-perceptions of black and white children in segregated schools in Washington, D.C., with those in integrated schools in New York. Their results, published in 1939 and 1940, revealed crucial information about how children perceive themselves. Let's take a closer look. The Clarks designed a series of experiments to understand how segregation impacted the self-image of black children. They placed two dolls before each child, one with white skin and blonde hair, the other with brown skin and black hair. Then they asked a series of questions. Which doll is the nice doll? Which doll is the bad doll? Which doll do most people like? Which doll do you like? Which doll looks like you? A majority of the children, including black children, identified the white doll as the nice doll and the black doll as the bad one. Even more troubling, when asked which doll looked like them, some black children hesitated or even refused to answer. Their research led them to a powerful and troubling conclusion. School segregation was not just about physical separation, it was about psychological harm. Through their doll studies, the Clarks found that many black children associated positive qualities with white dolls and negative qualities with black dolls. This response was not accidental. It reflected how systemic racism and segregation shaped black children's self-perception. In segregated schools, black children internalized the message that they were less valued in society. The Clarks concluded that segregation damaged identity development by making black children question their worth. It influenced not just how they saw themselves, but how they believed others saw them, leading to lower self-esteem, self-doubt, and internalized inferiority. The Clarks' work showed that psychology could reveal the deep and lasting effects of discrimination. Their research remains a crucial reminder that identity is shaped by our environment, and that equality in education is more than access. It's about dignity, self-worth, and the right to develop a strong and positive sense of self. For decades, segregation in American schools was upheld under the doctrine of separate but equal, established by Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896. But by the mid-20th century, psychologists Kenneth and Mamie Phipps Clark provided scientific evidence that segregation was not only unequal, but deeply harmful. The Clarks' research, particularly their doll studies, played a key role in the landmark Supreme Court case Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka in 1954. Their studies showed that segregation harmed Black children's self-esteem, reinforcing feelings of inferiority from an early age. The Supreme Court justices took note. Chief Justice Earl Warren referenced the Clarks' findings in the court's unanimous decision, stating that separating children solely based on race generated a sense of inferiority that may affect their hearts and minds in a way unlikely ever to be undone. With this historic decision, Brown v. Board of Education overturned Plessy v. Ferguson, declaring segregation in public schools unconstitutional. The ruling set the stage for desegregation across the United States and became a catalyst for the broader civil rights movement. Thanks to the Clarks' research, psychology became a powerful tool for social justice, proving that science could influence policy and shape a more equitable society. The legacy of Brown v. Board of Education lives on today, reminding us of the profound impact research can have in the fight for equality.